Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode in our close readings of Slow Down by Kōhei Saitō. Today we continue reading the 6th chapter, Capitalism, Scarcity and Communism's Abundance. Last week we spent quite a long time going through Saito's thesis that capitalism produces scarcity. We explained why, and we gave several examples of how scarcity is created by capitalism, but the essential one is that capitalism produces scarcity by dividing the commons. So if we agree on this, then Marx's famous definition of communism is the negation of negation takes a clear meaning. Okay, by the way, the negation of negation, that's it is found in at the end of chapter 32 of Das Kapital Volume 1, the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. So there is a first negation, okay, and that first negation is capitalist private property produced by the capitalist mode of appropriation. So there is an appropriation of something, and this act of appropriation is done in such a way that it produces capitalist private property. Now, in Marx's Das Kapital, what is appropriated is individual private property, and it is turned into capitalist private property. So it is the first expropriation of the means of production that prior to this appropriation belonged to individuals, when individuals claimed property over land and tools because they work on it and with those tools. So individual private property's principle is the labor of its proprietor, okay, or proprietor. Anyways, it means that I am working on this land and this is the object of my labor and therefore it is mine. But by contrast, capitalist private property claims just a legal right to owning the land and tools, and thus what is produced on that land with those tools belongs to the owner, even if the owner didn't work on that land or work with those tools. And then you have the second negation, which occurs when the when the capitalist private property is abolished, but it's not a return of individual private property, but the establishment of just individual property. You just take the term private out. So individual private property, that's the fantasy of the bourgeoisie, of the petty bourgeoisie, where each individual works independently on his own property. So it is still exclusive and thus always has the potential to turn into capitalist property. Individual property, however, it is individual, but as Marx says, it is based on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. So it is basically communism. But in Capital Volume 1, Marx was talking about the European way to get to communism at a time where common property has in much of the continent disappeared. And so that's why he called the cooperation and possession in common of land and the possession of the possession in common of the means of production, he called them the achievements of capitalism. Capitalism, Marx argued, was creating its own negation. While isolating workers, it was also bringing them together in the form of the proletariat, therefore preparing them for communism. And so a Eurocentric reading of this would imply two things. First, that in order to get to communism, you have to pass through individual private property, turn it into capitalist private property, and then get to communism, to individual property. And second, individual property is in the return of a more archaic property than individual private property, because it was often believed that humans never in the past enjoyed this sort of archaic property because they were too poor and backward, unscientific for that. But as we've seen, this archaic property did exist, it's common property, and it was already based on socialist and communist tendencies. Many had a communal management of resources, cooperation between the members, and didn't live in scarcity but in abundance. So we are talking about the commons here. Now, you can argue that in those ancient societies, individuality didn't exist and everyone was identified with the tribe, like members didn't have their own individual identities separate from the tribe. And communism, on the other hand, preserves individual identities. But that's fine, since individual identities, to truly flourish, need to have a social and sustainable environment that only the commons can provide. Thus, the negation of negation now takes the meaning of a return of the commons, but on a higher global level, more rational, more scientific. And the first negation is no longer the negation of individual private property, but simply the negation of common property, that of the commons. Like Saito says, the first negation is the division of the commons by capital. Communism, as the negation of this negation, aims to reclaim the commons and restore radical abundance. Capitalism manufactures artificial scarcity to perpetuate itself. This makes abundance its natural enemy. The key to restoring radical abundance is the reclamation of the commons. Indeed, it's the commons that will enable us to overcome capitalism and restore radical abundance in the 21st century. So there, communism seeks to restore abundance of the commons found in the hunter-gatherer society, social arrangement, the Germanic Mark associations, the Russian communes, etc. And so today we'll focus on that, on communism's abundance as opposed to capitalism's scarcity that we covered last week. We saw that capitalism creates artificial scarcity by dividing the commons, and it is necessary for it to do so, otherwise it won't increase value and it won't be able to price resources. So abundance means impossibility to make profits, and therefore capitalism needs to keep most people in a state of scarcity. But that doesn't mean that communism is abundance just because the capitalist alternative is scarcity. We must now demonstrate the relation between abundance and communism. And so this is what we will do in this episode. So if communism is abundance, because it's a return of the commons, then the commons must be abundant too. How then the commons relate to abundance? Well, first, last week we mentioned the work of Elinor Ostrom on the commons, and she said that there are three ways to manage the commons. The commons imply a certain dilemma, which is that an unrestricted free access to resources for everyone can lead to the rapid depletion of the resources, and therefore soon enough there won't be enough resources for most people, which leads to a situation of scarcity. And so this is called the tragedy of the commons, and we already explained it last week, and we explained why it is inaccurate and wrong. But to avoid it, there has to be, some sort of control and restriction of that access to some extent. If the in the public's mind, there are only two ways to make sure that people won't overuse the commons: privatization and nationalization. We either leave the commons up to the markets, and since the markets will put a price on the commons, pricing them will restrict use, or we nationalize the commons, making them state property. The state controls the commons, and therefore it prevents overuse by the population. But these two ways don't work, and they are more likely to damage the commons. We've already seen that capitalism breeds scarcity by damaging the commons and denying access to those without sufficient funds to resources that they need in order to survive and have good lives. If the point of restricting access is to avoid overuse, then market management of the resources is counterproductive. And overuse means that you are using resources for purposes way beyond your needs. If everyone just sticks to need satisfaction, including physical but also emotional, cognitive, and artistic needs as well, there would be no overuse. But we see the empirical reality that there are so many people who don't even have access to resources to meet their most basic needs when those resources are managed by markets. That's why access to electricity or water is first and foremost a human right that should never be denied or left up to the marketplace to provide. It is precisely the marketization and commodification, so privatization, of the commons that causes their depletion and overuse. So the first way is unrealistic. Pricing the commons simply means that you end up with people who cannot afford them, and therefore the marketplace denies access while others have way more than enough. When you consider the number of people living without electricity in the world while others control entire big tech companies, it is infuriating. So we have an engineered scarcity, so we cannot see the relation between the commons and abundance if we manage them through the marketplace. And the same holds true for the second way, nationalization. Ostrom calls this the Leviathan way, that to avoid, environmental degradation of the commons, the only way is to have a government with major coercive power step in and take control over natural resources. However, in the previous chapter on accelerationism, we pointed, through André Gorce's terminology, to the distinction between locking technologies and open technologies, and argue that only open technologies are compatible with the commons. So to opt for locking technologies means making the commons vulnerable, and they will probably most certainly be destroyed. And so the problem is that a state will always opt for the development of locking technologies under nuclear power. And so that's what's certainly going to happen if we nationalize resources like electricity. It will be used for powering and developing locking technologies like nuclear energy, which rely on fossil fuel power plants. And as always, they will likely be placed in areas where poor people and minorities live, polluting their air and causing myriad of health problems. In other words, nationalization is just sacrificing safety for utility, which goes against the very spirit of the commons. And therefore, a third way imposes itself, a way that hands control of natural resources over to the citizens themselves. An alternative way to attain the goal of treating electricity as a form of commons is citizen management. This is a practice by which sustainable energy can be easily handled at the citizen level. A concrete example of this is the recent spread of renewable energy production by citizen-owned power plants and energy cooperatives. A twist on privatization, it's a form of private citizen-ization. So first, don't let the word private scare you here. This isn't private in the sense of capitalist or petit bourgeois property, and we will explain what's meant by the term private citizenization of the commons. Now, like Saito said, the practice of private citizenization of the commons already exists in the example of citizen-owned power plants and energy cooperatives. Like I said, locking technologies, which always lead to loss of political power and environmental degradation, is the kind of technology that comes with governmental control over natural resources. By contrast, the citizen-owned energy cooperatives and power plants are open technology-based. You won't find citizens owning resources like uranium or oil or fossil fuel energy producing cooperatives or nuclear power plants, because these technologies require exclusive ownership to function, either by private capitalist owners or state bureaucracy. They are technologies that rely on scarcity, and as such they are expensive, so only a few can own and thereby manage them. On the other hand, the citizen-owned cooperatives and power plants function with unlimited and free open technologies like hydropower, wind or solar power that can be managed by anyone and anywhere. So, if management of the commons is based on sustainability and the kind of technologies that are compatible with the management of the commons are open technologies, then only renewable energies can be an open technology. But since it's an open technology, it has to be abundant and free. So we are talking about energy sources that are decentralized and available for everyone. Anyone can have access to it and use it. And so this arrangement by itself will require that the technologies aimed at here cannot be scarce. Oil, nuclear power, and uranium, these are scarce and unrenewable energy sources. Thus, they cannot be owned by citizens. That's why capitalism will always opt for these energies, because it can have complete control over them, monopolize them, and make them scarce. Otherwise, it won't be able to monetize those resources. If you cannot induce scarcity, then you cannot make money. And so this is capitalism's dilemma. If you want renewable, abundant energies like capitalism promises, then you won't be able to monetize them, which goes against capitalism's own nature and goal. And as such, capitalism has only made us waste too much time by deliberately delaying energy transition. If industries are so lagging behind for decades and struggle to make the transition to sustainable energy, now you know why. It's because they try to do so while preserving a market economy which is inherently based on scarcity. So if you truly want to transition to renewable energy and spread its adoption, your only option is private citizenization, which means the citizen management of municipalization of energy production, which is essential to the widespread adoption of renewable energy. It represents an opportunity to construct small-scale power networks amenable to democratic management, free from the profit motive and capitalizing on its inherently dispersed and decentralized nature. If we miss this opportunity, it will be all too easy for capital to reestablish its monopoly on the resource by clearing forests to create mega solar power plants, leading to further desertification and environmental destruction. So, like I said, these private citizenization attempts already exist and gained relative success in the UK, Denmark, Germany, and also Japan. Saito mentions the growing pressure by Japanese citizens on city councils to encourage investment in private and green stocks, as well as initiatives to encourage local production of energy for local consumption. These initiatives include utilizing abandoned fields by covering them with solar panels, for example. These attempts have all been increasing as a response to the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in March 2011, which is a disaster rated a level 7 accident on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. Which is, the highest level to measure the gravity of a nuclear disaster, and there were only two in history, the Fukushima disaster and Chernobyl. Yes, that disaster was as bad as Chernobyl, resulting in a temporary exclusion zone of 20 kilometers around the plant. Now, Saito gives in note 134 a Japanese book as a reference about the anti-nuclear movement in Japan, but since I cannot read Japanese, I looked for other sources on the internet, Wikipedia, an article, and yes, after the disaster, protests have drawn tens of thousands of people. In 2013, for example, there was a massive anti-nuclear marches in Tokyo. Like one march had 40,000 protesters marching in Tokyo, calling on the government to reject nuclear power, and then another in June, this time 60,000 against the government's plan to restart nuclear power plants. You also had groups like Sayonara nuclear power plants that mobilized signature campaigns and rallies, and all of this resulted in Fukushima experienced a boom in local solar energy projects. And so these projects include turning the evacuated and decontaminated lands, once used for agriculture, into mega solar farms. For instance, in Iitate, I think that's how it is pronounced, it's a village in Fukushima, which was a fertile farming area, but after the disaster it turned into contaminated land stripped of top soil. So that village has been leased to power companies for solar panel installation. And you also have the Tomioka Mega Solar Power Plant, Sakura, a 30 megawatts solar farm built on 350,000 square meters of farmland and led by local residents. So while these disasters are relatively rare, their cost cannot be neglected, especially when it is the average citizens who have to bear it. They are the ones who suffer these consequences. Plus, with the shock doctrine, which tries to seize the opportunity for further deregulation and more private control over resources, which will, only increase the chances for further accidents. And add to that the cost on the environment, which means that there are now less usable natural resources, which increases the scarcity of those resources and make them more vulnerable to market logic. Of course, private companies won't try to fix these messes until they are guaranteed that doing so will increase their profits, by which we mean that they will make the situation worse. Also, locking technologies make everyone dependent on it, since it tries to provide for a huge number of people, but from a centralized point. So this means that most of the energy we consume comes from power plants that are far away. Almost none of the energy we consume within our communities is produced locally in our communities, which only worsens the burden on the environment. Having one giant power plant providing the energy for dozens of departments is certainly cheaper from the point of view of profit, but more expensive in terms of environmental cost than it would be if each community was left to produce and consume its energy locally. Saito says that when you have non-profit local energy companies that produce electricity, that will be, consumed locally as well. Okay, that energy will be consumed locally as well. And so the money paid for electricity stays in the community that way. It doesn't go to private owners who are not part of the community since they don't contribute to anything. They are parasites that by their simple right of owning the company, demand a profit from the money that the company generated. So even if the owner lives with you, he's not part of the community. He's an external agent. Same thing with the state, who may not be driven by profit on paper, but operates through a disconnected bureaucracy that claims to know better the interests of all communities dissolved within the national borders. So, a state will also concentrate energy production to provide for all communities on the territory, which not only makes everyone reliant on it to survive, but it will also cause unacceptable environmental damage. So the best thing to do then is to produce and consume energy locally, so the money that stays in the community, since it belongs to the community instead of a capitalist owner or state, that money will be reinvested into improving the lives of people who live in the area by those same people's decision. So such a process confers a sovereignty to the community, since now we have a democratic management of the resources. And such management is very unlikely to result in the overuse of resources or the use of non-renewable energy, since those resources are very difficult to use and are extremely expensive. And as such, you will have much greater chances at achieving sustainability and social justice by handing over resource control to citizens than by relying on the capitalist class or the state. In the process, citizens gain a stronger sense of sharing a commons that improve their lives, leading to more active participation in civic life and resource management. Once such a cycle begins, a region's environment, economy, and society begin to synergize, revitalizing the community. This is what it means to transition to a sustainable economy via the commons. Now, of course, returning land and water to citizens isn't enough. We also need to have the means of production that are broader than just bare natural resources. The commons are natural resources and the means of production. So it wouldn't make sense for capitalists to hand over the land and water they expropriated, but not the means of production. So with the return of natural resources to the commons, we also need, quote, organizations allowing workers to invest jointly in the co-ownership and co-management of the means of production without interference from capitalists and shareholders. So these are workers' co-ops or workers' cooperatives. It's a form of company in which the means of production doesn't belong to just a few shareholders like the board of directors or CEOs, but belong to everyone who works in the company. Workers then take the decisions instead of their boss. They decide what to produce, how to produce and consume, what to invest and how to invest through democratic processes of deliberation. If the point of reclaiming the commons isn't just sustainability but social justice, and we've seen that the two cannot be separated, then it's also about breaking the influence of capitalism. It's to dismantle the powerlessness in which capitalism traps us. So it is also about agency. If only a few have agency over issues that concern everyone, you can be sure that everything will get worse. And even those who have agencies in these situations only have an illusion of it, since they are all as powerless as the rest of us, and that's why they need the powerless to toil on their between quotation marks, their fields and their machines. Without slaves, they won't last one day. So, quote from Saito again, workers' co-ops play a crucial role in workers regaining their autonomy and power of self-determination. every member of a co-op invests in, owns, and operates the enterprise. It's the workers who have the agency to discuss and determine what sort of work will be done and how it will take place. What enables such agency is that the co-op is not the private holding of a CEO or a group of shareholders, nor a national enterprise run by a government, but a form of socialized ownership by the workers themselves. So these organizations, they are not new, by the way. They existed as way back as in 1844 and were praised by Marx in several passages of his writings. For example, Saito mentions the Rockdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, which opened in 1844. And it's a very fascinating story. So founded in 1844 in Rockdale, so it's a city in England, the society emerged in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, when working class communities faced extreme poverty, exploitable labor conditions, and limited access to quality goods. So it was created by 28 weavers and artisans, including figures such as William Cowper, Charles Haworth, I think that's how it is pronounced, and Samuel Ashworth. And so these figures put forth the need for economic self-determination and sought to establish a consumer cooperative that would provide affordable, high-quality goods while fostering solidarity and collective responsibility among its members. So the society's innovative framework became known as the Rockdale Principles, which laid the foundation for modern cooperatives worldwide. And so these principles emphasized voluntary and open membership, democratic governance with one vote, with one member, one vote, limited returns on capital, surplus distribution according to patronage, and the education of members in cooperative ideals. Now, in practice, what did this look like? Well, the Rockdale pioneers opened a small store selling basic necessities. And you know what, by the way, the store still exists. I mean, it's now a museum to visit and see the history of this first cooperative in England. How did it work? Well, the workers were pooling their capital to purchase goods wholesale and returning profits to members. And so this approach ensured both sustainability and replicability, and its success inspired the global cooperative movement. So Marx took a deep interest in this British cooperative movement and praised the efforts of workers' co-op, though he remained a bit critical towards some aspects. Saito quotes him. So this is Saito quoting Marx, acknowledging the cooperative movement as one of the transforming forces of the present society based upon the class antagonism. He goes on to assert that the workers' cooperative movement shows how it was possible to replace the current capitalist system founded on scarcity with the republican and beneficial system of the association of free and equal producers, even calling the workers' co-op an example of possible communism. So Marx did say that, but there is a mistake in the quotation. I mean, it's not really a mistake, but it's something that can mislead us. There are two quotes actually in the passage, and Saito gives the sources in note 135 and 136, giving two different sources. But both are actually from the same quote, from the first source. And it is just the expression possible communism that comes from the second source, okay? Like the whole first quote reads, we acknowledge the cooperative movement as one of the transforming forces of the present society based upon class antagonism. Its great merit is to practically show that the present pauperizing and despotic system of the subordination of labor to capital can be superseded by the republican and beneficent system of the association of free and equal producers. So this first quote is about the cooperative movement being a transforming force of class society, and it comes from his August 1866 instructions for the delegates of the Provisional General Council and submitted to the First General Congress of the International Working Men's Association held in Geneva in September. So these were instructions that Marx submitted to the International Working Men's Association about what to do and what to promote in their revolutionary agenda. Among the instructions, you have the shortening of the working day to 8 hours as the legal limit of the working day, plus the pauses for the meals. It also includes the prohibition of child labor, well, actually just child labor by night or in health-injuring conditions. But Marx isn't opposed to child labor. He's just opposed to it in the conditions under capitalism, but he recognized that it is important for children to be involved in production as well, since they too will soon, grow up to be workers. But he insists that labor for children obviously has to be way shorter than adults. It has to be accompanied with education, and he distinguishes 3 parts of education for children: mental education, bodily education, like that's exercise, gymnastics, and technological training, like children must become acquainted with the labor and production processes and of trade tools and instruments. And then there are instructions on cooperative labor, and what's interesting here is that Marx stresses the importance for cooperative labor because he wants to preserve the spontaneous movements of the working classes, which means that labor, in order to be cooperative, must be free. And so he tells the International that it is important not to dictate or impose any doctrinary system on labor. And that requires co-ops with no special system of cooperation. Instead, the International should only give principles to follow for the success of the co-op. So the quote is the first principle about the importance of co-ops and their role in overcoming class antagonism, pauperization, and the despotic system of the subordination of labor to capital, that is, subsumption, when everything, including labor, serves capital instead of people's needs. So such an organization can only be the Republican system of the association of free and equal producers. Republican means that you are free from dominance and coercion. And this requires the second principle, which argues that this transformation needs general social changes, so changes of the general conditions of society by transferring state power from capitalists and landlords to the producers themselves. The third principle is that co-ops shouldn't be limited to co-op stores, but also, and most importantly, production. If co-ops are just stores in which you sell stuff, but the stuff itself wasn't produced in a cooperative form, that would be meaningless. So that's limited to just the surface of the present economic system, while the groundwork remains the same. Fourth principle, all cooperative societies must convert one part of their joint income into a fund for propagating and spreading their principles. So they are local, but they must reach out to all parts of society and even the world to promote these principles. And lastly, all workmen employed must have an equal share in the co-op. So these are the 5 principles laid down by Marx for successful cooperatives, and these were examples of possible communism since they are working on communist principles. But the expression possible communism comes from another text by Marx, his 1871 pamphlet, The Civil War in France. So that's a text about the aftermath of the Paris Commune, the short-lived revolutionary government that ruled Paris from March to May 1871. So a little bit of context. In July 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out between Napoleon III's Second Empire and Bismarck's Prussia. So in September 1870, France lost an important battle, that of Sedan, and Napoleon III was captured. With the empire toppled, the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris, but the city remained under siege by Prussia. Then the new government of this Third Republic, dominated by conservatives and monarchic forces, soon signed an armistice with Prussia. So Paris, which had endured a brutal 4-month siege, well, they kind of felt betrayed by this decision. And so tension grew between the radical working class Parisians and the more conservative national government, which had relocated to Versailles under Adolphe Thiers. And on March 1871, the government attempted to disarm Paris by seizing the National Guard's cannons at Montmartre. And so the attempt backfired, and now Parisians resisted, and soldiers fraternized with civilians, and the uprising began, culminating in the Paris Commune, established on March 28, 1871, as a radical self-governing council. And so its policies included abolition of conscription and standing armies and replacing them with a people's militia, separation of church and state, remission of rents and debts accumulated during the war, the election of officials subject to recall and paid workers' wages, and most importantly, worker control over factories abandoned by owners, turning them into co-ops. And so this lasted for only about 72 days until La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, in late May 1871, when government troops stormed Paris and massacred tens of thousands of communards, bringing, an end to the Commune. So Marx, who was at the time residing in London, paid deep attention to the events of the Commune and published his thoughts in that pamphlet, The Civil War in France. And so what interests us here is the passage where he characterizes co-ops by possible communism in the section specifically on the Commune, because the pamphlet covers the events starting from July 1870. So what he says about the Commune is that it genuinely and rightfully struck fear in the heart of capitalist society and the state, because it called for the abolition of private property. And this, for the ruling class, is unacceptable. They even went as far as exclaiming that the abolition of private property means the abolition of civilization, which, it's how convenient. It's also ironic and hypocritical, because it is those same civilized men, the same who want to protect the foundation of civilization, who massacred tens of thousands of workers, including men and women alike, because, the Commune promoted gender equality too, by the way. So yeah, truly barbaric, too much woke ideology, I guess. And they also murdered children, by the way. So the French army's repression of the Paris Commune did not spare children. Accounts mention children being shot either while fleeing with their families or because they were suspected of being petits fédérés, young supporters of the communes or helpers of the communes. So families often lived around or behind the barricades. When these were stormed, soldiers fired without distinction, and children were among the casualties. And the surviving children of the communards often faced imprisonment with their parents or were placed in institutions stigmatized as children of criminals. So yeah, private property, the basis of all civilization. So this is a classical ideological move, by the way. Israel commits genocide, so everyone revolts, and suddenly we are calling for the abolition of the only democracy in the Middle East. Like the Commune, on the other hand, indeed intended to abolish private property, that class property which, in Marx's words, makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few. So the Commune was an attempt to negate negation, the expropriation of the expropriators. It wanted to make individual property real by transforming the means of production, land, and even capital from being, the means of enslaving and exploiting labor into instruments of free and associated labor. So that's also Marx, by the way. So cooperatives are the way towards that transformation. Marx insists that on that because he notices, like also today, that many from the ruling class have perceived the impossibility of continuing the present system and recognize the need for more co-ops, even becoming, apostles of cooperative production. But many of them just like the idea of the co-op, but don't really want to abolish their privileges and hand over their private property, so the transformation can remain superficial. Co-ops can also become an opium to, SDGs. So Marx says if cooperative production becomes a reality, not just a mouthpiece, if it is, to supersede the capitalist system, then cooperative society must be united to regulate national production upon common plan. So co-ops must take production under their own control, and again, this is Marx speaking, putting an end to the constant anarchy of capitalist production. Anarchy here is in its pejorative sense, as in disorder and chaos. He's not talking here about, anarchism, the political ideology very close to communism. And by the way, many communards, donc des communards, the revolutionary of the communes, many were anarchists. But anyways, once we get to that, once we see cooperatives, like they were, established in the communes, what else can we call that, if not possible communism? When Marx says that he's attacking those bourgeois ideologues who claim that communism is impossible as a social project, but Marx is like, here, before your eyes, it's possible. The commune did it. So now back to Saito. So workers' cooperatives, so workers' co-ops, are examples of possible communism, and Saito stresses that in German, the term worker co-ops is Genossenschaft. And so this term certainly reminds you of something, of the Marx Genossenschaft, the Marx association of the Germanic tribes. Marx frequently used the adjective form of that word, which is Genossenschaftlich. And so that's a term, that term also means association. A co-op is an association. It implies that those who are in cooperation, who are cooperating together, are each free individuals in the sense that they are free from domination. Individual property means that you have no one who can claim to be your master, no one who can take away from you your autonomy, agency, or freedom. And we've seen that freedom is grounded in the fact that you are not separated from your means of subsistence and production, meaning that you have access to the commons in both form, as natural resources and as means to transform those resources to satisfy your needs, so means of production. So once you know that you are free from domination, cooperation becomes an association. Free and equal workers come together to work together, to plan labor together, to plan production and consumption together in a democratic and sustainable way. So the negation of negation means the abolition of the expropriation of farmers' means of production during private accumulation and the enclosure of the commons to create scarcity. By a return to abundance of the commons, work is liberated. It becomes a free association, and that's what a co-op is, a free association of free and equal workers. He says, workers' cooperatives return the means of production to the hands of the producers through solidarity between workers and thus help restore radical abundance. So something that we have to address is the relationship between co-ops and the welfare state. According to Saito, workers' co-ops and the socialized ownership of enterprise are regaining popularity within the British Labour Party. He refers at note 137 to a document published by the Labour Party in 2017 titled Alternative Models of Ownership, where they list 3 models of alternative ownership, meaning non-private ownership, and that's, like we said, the co-ops, but also municipal and locally land ownership and national ownership. So, to briefly explain each one, the co-ops are an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So, this is that free association of workers that Marx championed and will be Saito's main focus. So these are businesses where the members and beneficiaries work for the cooperative and have direct ownership and control. They exist in various forms, including worker, consumer, producer, purchasing, and multi-stakeholder cooperatives. They are praised for their democratic ethos, their ability to preserve jobs during downturns, their more equal wage structures, and their productivity levels, which often rivals or even exceeds conventional firms. For example, in the US, plywood industry, co-ops are more efficient than conventional firms, with some estimates showing, a 6 to 14% productivity advantage. And to give you a few numbers, as of 2012, in the UK, around 500 worker co-ops existed in the UK, with just under 80,000 workers as members and a further 78,500 employed non-members. So employee-owned businesses were estimated to be worth £25 billion annually, about 2% of the UK GDP. In France, total employment accounted for by worker cooperatives is approximately 36,000. The Italian and Spanish worker cooperative movements are arguably the most successful in the high-income countries. Between these, the Italian movement is the largest, with over 800,000 people estimated to be working in the cooperative sector. Spain has 20,000 worker cooperatives, among them the Mondragon cooperatives, which we'll return to. But as a quick estimation, in 2008, the group as a whole employed around 100,000 people and includes around 250 cooperatives and affiliated organizations, including 73 manufacturing plants overseas. But they face some structural challenges, particularly the difficulty of assessing long-term finance, which leaves them vulnerable to underinvestment and takeover by capitalist firms. The US is the country in which, not surprisingly, co-ops struggle the most. Again, in the plywood industry, which is the sector the Labour Party focuses on, during 1942 and 57, worker cooperatives accounted for 20 to 25 of total plywood production in the USA, which had fallen to 14% by 1964, while 24 cooperatives were still active in 1964. This fell to 21 in 1972. Then 10 in 1989, 7 in 1990, and only 3 in 2001. So this, according to the report, is due to the shift in plywood production to the south, which was mainly organized by capitalist firms using less labor and intensive production methods. But they have ways to overcome those challenges through supportive trade associations, like a shelter organization whose function is to fund and promote the self-managed sector. In Italy, they rely on cooperative federation, like Liga Coop or Lega Coop. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. It's spelled Legacoop. And it provides financial support and legal protections. So Italian law requires the allocation of a certain part of annual profit to an indivisible reserve, currently 30%, and in the event of the cooperative being privatized, this reserve cannot be accessed by members or investors. So it helped convert hundreds of failing private firms into cooperatives involving tens of thousands of workers, and by the late 1980s it had 3.4 million workers as members. In Emilia Romagna, I think that's how it is pronounced, Legacoop directly accounted for 12.75% of GDP in this period, and it became the fourth highest exporter in Italy. France likewise mandates indivisible reserves to ensure stability, and Spain's Mondragon Group created its own cooperative bank to sustain growth called the Caja Laboral Popular, I think that's how it is pronounced, in 1959. And so this would become the central institution of the Mondragon Group, and today has 1,800 employees and generates a revenue in the order of 300 million euros annually. But that's also a problem, since what we are aiming at in this book in Slowdown is degrowth and an actual reduction of productivity if we understand productivity in a growth paradigm. So the Labour Party still tries to justify co-ops by their efficiency to promote growth, but as we will argue, the true relevance of co-ops is that they are enterprises that actually foster degrowth. So there are three main points that stand out through these shelter organizations. First, the federation's lobby on behalf of their constituent cooperatives work closely with trade unions and political parties, at least historically, and own financial institutions dedicated to providing credit and advice to cooperatives. Second, they are actively engaged in converting failing private enterprises into cooperatives. And finally, they are aided immensely by a sympathetic legal system and a sympathetic tax system. The second model that the British Labour Party document speaks of is the municipal and locally owned ownership, which transfers economic control to local councils or community-based enterprises. Municipal ownership refers to local governments running community services such as waste collection, the running of parks, the provision of broadband services, and the operation of public transport. So these models aim to counter the dominance of private corporations, promote community wealth building, and ensure that economic benefits remain local rather than being extracted by outside firms, by including greater economic resilience, more democratic decision-making, and a strong emphasis on social and environmental well-being. Examples of locally led ownership encompasses community businesses, development trusts, CICs, that's community interest companies, registered societies, and anchor institutions that reinvest profits back into the community. So community businesses can be many things. It can be a cooperative or a community-owned shop, a shop owned and generally also run by a local community, a community enterprise, a trade organization, a trading organization set up, owned and controlled by a geographical community or a community of interest. It can be a social enterprise, a business with primarily social objectives whose surpluses are primarily reinvested for that purpose in the business or the community, rather than being, driven by the need of to maximize profit for shareholders and owners. But it will generally have a governing body and a wider membership. Once an organization has a membership greater than 12 or 15, it becomes harder for its membership to be directly involved in management. It is also common in this situation for the membership to elect a smaller committee, the governing body, and delegate some of its powers to it. So this committee can meet more easily and make decisions between general meetings of the entire memberships. Development trusts are a particular type of partnership organization that offers benefits to the local community. They are owned and managed by the local community. They aim to achieve the sustainable regeneration of a community or address a range of economic, social, environmental, and cultural issues within a community. They are independent, but they seek to work in partnership with other private or public or third sector organizations. But their aim is to reduce dependency on grant support by generating income through enterprise and ownership of assets, and they engage in trading surpluses primarily reinvested in organization or community. Then you have the you have the CIC, and so the CIC, it's a company that has a lock on its assets, which prevents profits being distributed to members or shareholders other than in certain circumstances. So a CIC is obligated to pursue the community's interest and must report on how it does this to the CIC regulator. So a CIC is required to file a community interest report each year, and so this report must include details of the remuneration of directors, dividends paid on shares, and interest paid on certain types of loan. It must explain how it has pursued the community's interest and how it has involved stakeholders. Then you have also what we call a registered society, which is like a CAC, in that it conducts business for the benefit of its community. Profits are not distributed among members or external shareholders, but returned to the community. And lastly, you have anchor institutions, which are organizations with an important presence and a role in a community. They can be in local authorities, universities, trade unions, local businesses, and housing associations. So in terms of economic development, anchors can act as purchasers using local suppliers and producers, as employers recruiting locally, and as incubators supporting startup businesses and community organizations. For example, universities can provide technological innovation and research expertise for local businesses and support the economy through student spending. Housing organizations and hospitals can support local businesses through the purchase of local goods and services such as food, bed linen, and information technology. They also have a significant role as employers, holders of sizable land and property assets to be used for local benefit, and also as investors within the economy. So these are successful measures with many examples, which include community-owned shops, renewable energy initiatives, etc. And lastly, there's national ownership, which involves the state taking control of key sectors and key sectors of the economy, like for example energy, transport, health, and infrastructure. But we don't need to get into this one, since what interests us here is the citizen-ization process, which is at odds with nationalization, and we'll explain even more why. So anyways, for more information on how each of these models work, you can check the document. It's available and free online, and as Saito says, it proves that alternative models of ownership are gaining more popularity, and it is not just an alternative to privatization, but also to the welfare state. So this is why co-ops and municipal ownership aren't really compatible with nationalization in the context of degrowth. It's obvious that nationalization entails a welfare state, but the more you have co-ops, the smaller the welfare state, therefore smaller national ownership. But this doesn't mean the disappearance of welfare, but rather a more inclusive and broader welfare. See, the welfare state is like that distinction we made between co-op stores and co-op productions. The former remains just surface level. It doesn't challenge the way wealth was produced in the first place. So that is the welfare state. It operates as a model of wealth redistribution, and it is the prevalent model we have in the 20th century and to this quarter of the first quarter of the 21st century. But it refrained from touching the relations of production directly. So you have a capitalist mode of production in the groundwork that generates wealth by transforming the labor of the many into the wealth of the few, like Marx said, and then the welfare state tries to give back some, a very small sum, of that wealth back to the rest of society through income and corporate taxes. So companies make profits, again, that is taking the labor of the many and turning it into the wealth of the few, that's profits. And so the state takes a part of those profits and give it back to society in the form of healthcare, free education, infrastructure, etc. And so this is the dominant mode of wealth distribution we have. Co-ops, however, will challenge this mode of distribution because they will challenge the mode of production. The welfare state model of redistribution relies on profit, but once profit is abolished, then there is no point to the welfare state anymore, since it doesn't have from where to take wealth to redistribute it. So this will also challenge the role of labor unions as well, since they too, like the welfare state, rely on profit for distribution. Like I said, the wealth redistributed is only a part of profit. Okay, If the state redistributes 100% of profits, there would be no profit. Surplus value will immediately be redistributed. And so the role of labor unions so far has been to make that part bigger. They aim at increasing the pie available for redistribution. But when they do that, they fall into a vicious cycle, which at the end only serves capitalism. Labor unions, too, are vulnerable to the subsumption by capital. And that is, since they want to make the pie of redistribution bigger, then they have to help capitalists also increase their profits so that the pie also increases. Which means that labor unions want to raise productivity because then more profits, and so the pie of redistribution gets bigger. And so this leads them to cooperate with capitalists, which only gives capitalists more power over productivity, and so more influence on the decisions in production. And so the result is inefficient labor unions and the weakening of workers' autonomy. So both the welfare state and labor union want to increase profits because that would increase the pie of redistribution, but that means that the capitalist mode of production remains untouched, and so these two organizations end up, sooner or later, subsumed by capital. By contrast, Saito says, workers' co-ops aim to transform the relations of production themselves. Introducing democracy into the workplace allows workers to suppress competition amongst themselves and make joint decisions about development, education, and restructuring on their own terms. A major strength of co-ops is that workers can work as they wish. Co-ops aim to advance a social and solidarity economy, SSE, that restores the regional community through workplace training and management practices. Through labor, workers can make investment weighted toward the long-term prosperity of the region, and this amounts to nothing less than the democratization of the economy by making the realm of production itself into a form of commons. So here are the two major points of a co-op. First, unlike the organizations that end up subsumed by capital and thus reduce workers' autonomy, co-ops make workers truly independent, self-reliant, and autonomous. It does this by introducing democracy in the workplace. Every decision taken in the labor process and in production is run through the workers themselves. They make joint decisions, which means an abolition of the separation of conception and execution. And the second major point is that co-ops advance social and solidarity economies, the SSEs. An SSE is an economy that is not based on competition, but precisely on working together instead of trying to best one another. This means that economic decisions or policies and measure aim to long-term prosperity of the region, meaning that economic decisions of cooperatives aren't limited to the cooperatives' turnovers. This is why Marx insisted that co-ops must promote their principles, because the point of a co-op is long-term prosperity, which can only be achieved through the cooperation of all economic agents. Long-term prosperity is dependent on your environment. Thereby, you have a responsibility towards it. Everyone relies on the environment, and as such, no one can take a decision that can impact the environment without considering others who also rely and depend on that environment. And as such, cooperatives need to work together as well. A social and solidarity economy urges its agents to act for the greater good rather than for their own little margins. If you have competition as the driving economic motive, then you will prioritize short-term prosperity, which means profits. And no, there's no such thing as long-term profits. It's an oxymoron. Profits can only exist by exploitation and undemocratic management of labor and production, and this, we've seen, is an ecological catastrophe. So co-ops, because they are relieved from the pressure of competition, they can offer workers spaces in which they can work as they wish, free from market influence that forces them into working a certain way out of fear of being outclassed by their competitors. So relieved from competition, the incentive becomes cooperation. How to work freely in a sustainable manner. That means working in solidarity with others, thereby transforming the economy that dominates entire regions, nations, or even countries into economies of solidarity and well-being. And so this is the democratization of the economy. Everyone gets to enjoy and live in SSE. So, given that this can only be achieved through co-ops, private companies, the welfare state, and labor unions become obsolete, and so they will wither away. Citizens now, as workers, have unconditional access to the commons, and surplus produced is now distributed according to the needs of the communities. Education, hospitals, arts, public spaces, science, and innovation, infrastructure all receive funds, making then life better for everyone. Now, this doesn't mean that we are in communism yet, because co-ops, as they are right now, they still rely on profit-making to support the continuation of their enterprise. But it's a gradual evolution. You can say that this corresponds to socialism as a transition to communism. But profit for co-ops means something very different from profit for a private company. First, private companies are always at the mercy of market-driven speculation by investors, which means that they must always keep up with the rising value of scarcer commodities. So they are always driven to maximize their profits as quickly as possible. And once the value of real estate goes up, for example, companies must generate more profit before someone else beat them to it and raises the value of real estate further and quicker. So it is always maximizing short-term profits above all else. Co-ops, however, don't think of profits this way. Profits for them is just that surplus that surplus that we can invest to make not just the company but the community in which we work better. It works with a certain need to satisfy, a need in mind to satisfy. And that need has to be a social need. For example, there are some problems in the quality of education in our schools. The profit generated by the co-op tries to fix that. So it is not in a rush to stay relevant in the market. Rather, it takes its time to provide quality services to that need. So it still relies on a bit of competition since it is surrounded by market logic. So it is imperative, like Marx said, that co-ops don't stay isolated, applying these principles in their own bubble only, but must receive constant support from movement and also the state. This is not to say that it's impossible. On the contrary, it is possible, and we see that today the cooperative movement is growing and gaining popularity and support. All around the world, workers' co-ops are established and they persist. The most famous co-op is precisely Spain's Mondragon Corporation, which is a federation of workers' cooperatives with more than 74,000 members. And it was founded in 1956 by a Catholic priest, José María Arizmendiarrieta, I think that's how it is pronounced. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, I'm really sorry. But anyway, it was founded by that Catholic priest in the Basque town of Mondragon. It began with a small appliance factory and expanded into manufacturing, finance, retail, and education, all organized around democratic governance and solidarity among workers. So each employee is a member owner with voting rights, and profits are shared or redistributed to support weaker cooperatives. So the model of the Mondragon is so successful that even in the capitalist stronghold of the United States, workers' co-ops are growing following the Mondragon model. So the most famous examples are the evergreen cooperatives in Ohio, Corporation Buffalo in New York, and Corporation Jackson in Mississippi. So each one of them has a specific goal, which isn't profits, but to revitalize communities by addressing problems related to housing, green energy, food, waste disposal, and so on. The evergreen cooperatives, created in 2008, for example, focus on create stable living wage jobs for the low-income residents of Cleveland's neighborhoods, particularly in neglected areas that are seen unprofitable by capitalist standards. So, inspired by Mondragon, it consists of worker-owned businesses in sectors like laundry services, solar energy, and urban agriculture. And profits are shared among worker owners, and the businesses are designed to keep wealth in the community rather than allowing it to flow to outside investors. Corporation Buffalo in New York includes worker-owned cafes, tech services, and creative businesses aiming to create economic self-determination for local residents. Corporation Jackson, founded in 2014, seeks to build a sustainable, socially just economy, empowering African Americans and low-income communities through collective ownership and decision-making. So all of these cooperatives seem to have a specific goal. They all try to revitalize the economy of poor and vulnerable areas who were devastated by capitalism, and that is by implementing an alternative model to the capitalist system that simply breeds powerlessness. So their aim is to reclaim worker independence and freedom by the fact that employees are owners with decision-making power. Each worker has a vote in major in major business decisions. That profits stay locally, supporting the community, especially historically marginalized or economically neglected populations. Thus, they aim to build a network of democratic institutions to empower workers by tackling the structural problems of class, gender, and race, by addressing the needs of poor, unemployed, black, and Latin female residents. So Saito mentions such initiatives in Japan over 40 years also, with the increasing number of workers' co-ops in sectors like nursing, childcare, forest management, agriculture, waste disposal. And so these cooperatives have up to 15,000 people. In other words, co-ops choose to promote the kind of work that is neglected by the short-term profit-oriented capitalist companies, and it is neglected precisely because it is harder to monopolize and capitalize on it. We are talking about essential work, which is the kind of work that gives people true agency because it is work that makes people's lives better. And so that kind of work is always made scarce, in another sense, in capitalism. We said that capitalism thrives on scarcity, that the more something is scarce, the higher its value, but that depends on how useful it is. If it is really useful, but it is hard to capitalize on, even if it is scarce, then capitalism cannot make it disappear. It makes it the least of paid work, so to minimize its influence. And it is by making it underpaid. So the wages of managers, for example, are always incredibly bigger than that of nurses and teachers. Now that's because capitalism makes manager scarcer than nurses and teachers, thereby making the job of a manager more valuable, even though it is completely parasitical job. So necessary work is more abundant than unnecessary work. However, the impact of necessary jobs can be made scarce by limiting their wages and their resources to a bare minimum. Thereby not as many people can enjoy these necessary services, and even those who work there, because of the poor conditions in which they are confined, can end up looking for other jobs or not even appreciating the services they provide. In this sense, it's in this sense that necessary work is made scarce. You try to discourage people from engaging in empathetic work, for example, in work that should be free because it serves the community's needs, and therefore receiving such services shouldn't be conditioned on whether or not you can pay for it. So cooperatives try to solve this issue, to valorize necessary work. That's why all cooperatives are always driven towards the kind of work that capitalism devalues or scorns. To quote Saito, in economic systems that prioritize profit-making, essential work like childcare, cleaning, cooking, and waiting tables pays very little. This means that this type of work is done primarily by women of color and immigrants and divided from the rest of society, resulting in the end in the worsening of work conditions. It is another vicious cycle. To remedy this, workers' cooperatives aim to make essential work of this sort autonomous and desirable. The hope is that improving wages and working conditions will help revive the community by overcoming barriers of race, class, and gender. So again, the ambition of a co-op forces us to be extremely careful as not to make a single false step. Otherwise, it gets subsumed by capital and re-enters the competition paradigm. It will become driven by profits and starts practicing cost cutting, and efficiency will once again rule the day. So that's why we said that these co-ops must be accompanied by strong citizen movements and state action seized by workers as well. In short, a revolution is needed one way or another. So the only way for these cooperatives to remain is that their actions must coordinate with more collective action with one goal in mind. The system as a whole must change. So cooperatives, like Marx said, have this transformative force because they embody the no one left behind standpoint, resisting the impoverishment, discrimination, and inequality fostered by capitalism. So promoting it, like Marx says, means that workers' cooperatives can become the basis on which to transform society overall. So actions like co-ops and private citizen-ization are examples of democratizing the economy, meaning that you make the people usually excluded from it, like the poor, the marginalized minorities, have now a say in it. They become active agents as well, and they partake in the processes of decision-making that impact and shape our lives, like the lives of everyone. So solving climate change requires a democratic share of power, since most of this shit is happening because some are calling the shots while the most of us bear the consequences of these shots, and when we try to speak up, our voices are repressed. Solving climate change also requires fixing the balance in political power. So co-ops, they do precisely that. They balance power. They give back to workers, citizens, marginalized groups, their voice. These actions of reclaiming power are actually actions of reclaiming the commons. You don't really have a voice in political matters if you don't control the commons. Democratic participation and deliberation, when the commons keep getting divided and turning into capitalist private property, is like theatrical elections. So we need substantial change which relies on the return of the commons, a return to radical abundance to the people, and a break from the capitalist systems of scarcity. So these transformations must occur in all kinds of sectors. It's not just land or means of production, but anything that must be abundant and free because it's a human right. So we are also talking about education, healthcare, the internet. So these sectors have the potential to be abundant and free, to be commons and belong to the people. Saito also mentions the so-called sharing economy. It's a term that describes digital platforms that allow individuals to exchange goods, services, or access to underused assets. People can share what they already have and don't necessarily use, like spare rooms, cars, or skills. Suppose that I have a car but I don't drive that often. Well, instead of having someone else who needs a car buy another one, especially if they cannot afford it, I just can share my car, thus reducing waste, increasing efficiency, and enabling broader access. So it's kind of a peer-to-peer exchange of underutilized resources to promote ideals of efficiency, sustainability, and community. It centers on the idea of access rather than ownership, like we share tools, cars, and spaces for collective benefits. So it is an ideal that resonates with older cooperative practices such as community tool libraries or car-sharing collectives, which sought to distribute resources more equitably. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, and TaskRabbit are its most recognizable examples, but the sharing economy can easily be co-opted by platform-based business models, becoming platform capitalism, which is exactly what happens to Uber or like Uber or Airbnb. And the way to avoid that is to turn those platforms into commons. Like, for example, you make platforms like Uber or Uber publicly owned, and you abolish, these things like Airbnb. So all of these things, education, healthcare, the internet, platforms, or peer-to-peer exchange, they must all become commons and thus return abundance to the people. Another example are vaccines and drug treatments. It's used as parallel example of the idea of, reclaiming platforms like Uber for public ownership. In the case of Uber, the suggestion is, what if a privately owned digital platform were transformed into a commons, collectively owned and managed by the app users, democratically run and available for the public good instead of private profits? In the case of, the COVID-19 vaccines and treatments, the suggestion is, what if essential medicine, rather than, being patented, rationed, and sold for profit, were also treated as commons? That would mean universal access, global cooperation and distribution, and an emphasis on health as a right rather than as a commodity. So what Saito is saying is that life-saving technologies shouldn't have been controlled the way they had during the pandemic, with pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca patenting vaccines, keeping tight control over production and distribution. We also remember the unequal distribution and exchange between rich and poor countries. Rich countries hoarded doses, while poorer nations struggled to secure access. And in many cases, by the time the vaccine arrived to third world countries, they were past their expiration dates. So this privatization of medical knowledge and production capacity created huge inequalities in who could be protected, from the virus. So by making the vaccines a worldwide commons, the vaccine formulas and treatments would be open source of knowledge, freely shared across borders. So manufacturing would be distributed globally, not concentrated in wealthy nations, and the moral principle would be public health above profit, recognizing vaccines as global public goods. And so this would be a state of abundance. To quote Saito, via the commons, the collective management of productive activity can spread horizontally throughout society, independent of both the market and the state. The result would be goods and services becoming abundant that are now scarce and difficult to access without money. In short, the goal of restoring the commons is an attempt to reduce the reach of artificial scarcity and increase the radical abundance available outside the realms of consumerism and capitalism. So this abundance that Saito is talking about is outside the realm of consumerism, which is the realm of false abundance. It's only an abundance for a few people, those who can afford it, and don't have to see the growing scarcity that most people must endure. By contrast, reclaiming the commons will bring back abundance and democratize it for everyone by reducing the space taken by commodification. In Lauderdale's terms, we increase public wealth by reducing private riches, thus restoring radical abundance, and this without relying on the state. Remember the Lauderdale paradox that we saw last week? If you public wealth can only diminish if public riches increase. So the management of the commons can easily occur independently of the state. Commons like water sources and supply can be managed by autonomous regional bodies like municipalities. Spain did that, by the way, in Catalonia city's Teresa in 2018. The municipality took back control of water after a contract with the Grupo Akbar terminated. That's a Spanish water utility company. It started with a petition called Pact for the Public Management of Water in Teresa, and it gained 8,000 citizen signatures. So this was part of the campaign Water is Life, Agua es Vida, I think that's how it is pronounced. It's a coalition of community groups, trade unions, solidarity groups, and environmentalists in Catalonia to get back a public management of water. So the same is valid for electricity and farmland. They can be managed at the citizen level through cooperatives like energy cooperatives, where citizens collectively own wind turbines and solar panels. Germany, by the way, is a leading example in these cooperatives. I think that about 40% of Germany's renewable energy capacity is citizen or community owned. And in France, you have a global movement promoting food sovereignty and local community-based control over farmland with cooperatives like Terre de Liens, which buys farmland and leases it to farmers under conditions of ecological sustainability and collective ownership. Saito also mentions the possibility of cooperatives in the IT sector. I don't know if there actually are, but technically, I mean, it's possible too. You can have cooperative R&D platforms where coders, engineers, and designers pool resources, share profits, and decide collectively which innovations to prioritize, like green tech or public interest AI. Now, the most important thing is that, turning the economy towards cooperatives will not increase the GDP, but decrease it. Since the GDP is measured by private riches, then the more cooperatives you have, the greater the public wealth. And as we've seen with the Lauderdale paradox, when public wealth goes up, private riches go down. So the GDP will decrease, which means degrowth, and economy run by cooperatives is a degrowth economy. Again, degrowth does not mean people will become impoverished. Quite the contrary, it means, releasing people from the pressures of work by making work primarily necessary. We work to satisfy needs rather than producing value. Once those needs are satisfied, we can utilize the rest of our time to engage in leisure activity, mutual aid, knowledge, art, etc. So the amount of work that we have to put today to secure the necessities of life exceeds by far the amount that is actually necessary to secure those necessities. So by turning everything into a cooperative, we will reduce work to what is necessary. And as such, the space taken up by mutual aid, independent of the exchange of money, will expand, and thus the amount of time regained by the average person would be immense. In other words, work, in the traditional sense, that is, securing the necessities of life, will guarantee a stable lifestyle. From now on, we know that those necessities are available and there are enough of them for everyone. So the time usually taken up by work will decrease, while the amount of time and effort we can devote to mutual aid will increase. Imagine if you only work 4 to 5 hours a day because that's what is necessary to produce enough for everyone instead of 8 hours a day because you must produce a surplus for the boss to make a profit. While already with 5 hours, you have made a surplus enough to feed or sustain everybody else. Now, instead of staying 4 additional hours on the production line or in the office, you can devote yourself to supporting social causes, to engage in voluntary work and other socially and individually beneficial activities, not because you feel pressured by the market to do them, but simply because you want to. So in short, reducing the GDP through co-ops means that you can spend more time actually with non-consumerist activities. So to quote Saito, there will be more opportunities to do sports, go hiking, take up gardening, and get back in touch with nature. We will have time once again to play guitar, paint pictures, read. We can host those close to us in our homes and eat with friends and family. We will have the free time to volunteer or engage with politics. The consumption of fossil fuel energy may decrease, but the community's social and cultural energy will rise up and up. Compared to cramming ourselves into crowded subways every morning and eating our daily lunches in front of our computers as we work non-stop for hours and hours every day, this is clearly a richer lifestyle. We would no longer have to shop online or drink ourselves into oblivion just to rid ourselves of the stress of simply surviving. If we regain the time necessary to cook for ourselves and exercise, our health will surely improve as well. We have been overworking ourselves with the belief that economic growth will bring prosperity and happiness. Capitalists benefit greatly from our diligence. Within the framework of capitalism, our dream may be to become rich, but the essence of capitalism is scarcity, making it impossible for this dream to be realized by everyone. So I think that's pretty much cut and dry. If we talk about abundance in the hopes that we want a richer lifestyle, the choice seems to be easy to make. Capitalism as the growth economy par excellence needs to be replaced as soon as possible with degrowth communism. Capitalism has told us, or capitalism has sold us, this false myth that it is through economic growth only that we can hope to get a richer lifestyle. But we've spent months now showing why that can't be the case, and that the more we persist in economic growth, the poorer our lifestyles actually get. Hence, we need to find another way to make people's lives stable and rich without relying on economic growth to provide for us. So the alternative is degrowth communism. It is about the closure of the enormous gulf separating the capitalist class and the proletariat, which since the 19th century only widened and has been polarizing towards an ultra-rich 1% and the 99% by utilizing the ecological crisis it engineered. So by closing that gap once and for all, the imperative of scarcity will be abolished. Capitalism is a system that only functions by generating scarcity. Scarcity is a given in capitalism. It's an imperative for capitalism to exist. And once scarcity is abolished, capitalism suffocates to death. So it will lose all incentive to force us to work for more than what we have to and more than what the earth can bear, especially. In communism, however, things will be different. Society will require fewer hours of labor to function, and therefore the burden on the planet will lessen and the lives of almost everyone will improve because there will be no further need for needless labor. So the move from growth to degrowth is, like Saito says, a major paradigm shift. It's not just a shift from one economy to another, but a shift in perspectives, in epistemological paradigms entirely. And so this is a radical epistemological break, a break from everything that we thought we knew until this point. A redefinition of scarcity and abundance, that is what we've been doing all of these weeks. Understanding abundance in this new communist paradigm makes us reevaluate degrowth and see it not as a form of voluntary poverty, a call for all of us to choose impoverished lives in the name of protecting the environment. No, this is like that environment, that argument that we hear from, for example, sometimes from third world countries when they are blamed for producing pollution due to their attempt at industrializing their nations. Quite often third world countries will respond by saying that if we don't industrialize, we'll never develop economically and we will have to remain in poverty. There's certainly a hypocrisy in this because first, it's often an accusation made by first world countries who are themselves big polluters. And even the ones who aren't, we've seen that they still are because of the Netherlands fallacy. So it seems that the argument is an ideological tool to keep the southern hemisphere in a state of poverty and so unable to compete with the North. So the North doesn't care at all for the environment since they don't seem to be willing to lower their economic growth and expansion. It's just something that they say to their emerging rival, who, by the way, they are in a state of poverty because of the centuries of colonialism and foreign intervention in their national affairs by the North. So yes, that argument is 100% ideological and it is just a rhetorical tool to keep the southern countries, the South, dependent on the North. But we need to remember that economic growth isn't the way out of poverty either, but rather it just makes, perhaps at best, a few people out of poverty while accelerating the same process that makes poverty since it depletes the resources necessary for a rich lifestyle. So when the North tells the South that economic growth is bad for the environment is capitalist ideology, the claim that economic growth is necessary for a rich lifestyle is also capitalist ideology, perhaps a more harmful one. Saito calls it the curse of growth. It makes the bold claim that growth is necessary for a rich life, but the moment we start growing economically, what we see is a growth in scarcity, despite economists keep showing graphs with curves that go up and telling us to rejoice. So the reality, however, doesn't match those graphs because what they measure is the value of commodities. Yes, in capitalism, commodity value goes up, but that doesn't mean a richer lifestyle in a substantial sense. What needs to be taken as a measure is not value of commodity, but use value. Economic growth always needs to count commodity value. So we are already choosing voluntary poverty every time we opt for capitalism. Every time we bow down to austerity, every time we go along with capitalist measures, we have chosen poverty. Whenever we choose to base reality of our lifestyle's worth on commodity value, we accepted poverty. So neoliberal austerity demands we withstand impoverishment, we withstand meager lifestyles because, again, the only way for it to generate value is by generating artificial scarcity. So to use Saito's words, we are not impoverished because we don't produce enough, we are impoverished because scarcity is capitalism's essence. The basis for this is the opposition of use value and value of commodities. So in capitalism, even if you produce enough, which technically we do under capitalism, we will have impoverished lives because we just stare at all of that, production without access to it. We just watch it rot away while those who can afford it are the ones that only get to enjoy it. And as the number of us who cannot afford those goods increases, the value of those goods increases as well. So scarcity in both form and content, it starts with form. There is, enough for everyone technically, but access is denied unless you have the money for it. But as the capitalists keep producing this way, it forces people to engage in even more human activities to be able to afford those goods. And so these activities increase the burden on the planet, which, deplete the resources to the point where resources become physically scarce, where they won't be enough for everyone physically. So we got from scarcity in a formal sense to scarcity in a physical sense now. In communism, however, since the evaluating criteria is use value, production will not only be enough, but it will also be sustainable, meaning that there is neither scarcity in form nor content. That just, necessitates a break from the growth paradigm. So communism and degrowth is the only possible and rational combination for a human sustainable and rich lifestyle. Radical abundance is only possible in degrowth communism. So Saito quotes from Jason Hickel about this, while austerity calls for scarcity in order to generate more growth, degrowth calls for abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. So that's from the conclusion of Haeckel's article, Degrowth, A Theory of Radical Abundance, which is basically a restatement of what we've seen so far about growth, degrowth, the Lauderdale paradox, which degrowth attempts to invert, reducing private riches to increase public wealth. And there are additional examples of the paradox in play. For example, Haeckel mentions how, for the sake of private riches and GDP, what was once abundant and free had to be made scarce through the example of the salt tax by the British Raj imposed on India. Salt was abundant and free all along India's coasts, but the British banned people from gathering it and taxed its consumption in order to create what became a significant revenue stream for the colonial government. The abolition of public wealth here generated public riches. And like we said, the same process is happening today in the endless waves of privatization unleashed all over the world since the 1980s, in education, healthcare, transportation, libraries, parks, swimming pools, water, even social security. And so these measures, they push people to work more while they get less of what they used to have free access to. Like he says, chopping away at what remains of the commons so that people deemed too comfortable or lazy are placed once again under threat of hunger and forced to increase their productivity if they want to survive. In England, people are still suffering today of the same rhetoric and its consequences of the government of British Prime Minister David Cameron and his Finance Minister George Osborne, who conducted welfare cuts explicitly in order to get shirkers to work harder and to be more productive, the famous workfare rhetoric. So these were the austerity measures, still at play, still gaining more power, still spreading and increasing scarcity. And degrowth is the opposite of that, argues Haeckel. It's the way to solve the Lauderdale paradox. So this is not at all like some people have argued that it is voluntary poverty and portrayed it as a new version of austerity, this time promoted by the left rather than the right, an extreme manifestation of old school environmentalists who want to force everyone to live miserable lives. Nothing can be further from the truth, as we've seen so far. Now, yes, austerity measures, that's neoliberalism, and we've seen that there are people who want to distinguish between capitalism and neoliberalism, saying that we can preserve the former, but it's the latter that is, to condemn. Sure, if your enemy is just austerity, you can, try to solve this by spreading money around so that people can buy everything they need without having to work as much, and thus, you'd reduce their impact on the planet. But we don't want to just save the planet, because if that is just what we need, well then why not choose the kind of poverty most people picture in their heads, right? Why not just, return to live directly in the jungle? Or why not just, commit collective suicide? That will save the planet too, right? But that's not what we want. We want to save the planet because we want a rich and sustainable lifestyle for as many life forms as possible, including humans. We want a good life. Simply revoking neoliberalism is like opting for such options and keep having a few individuals who get to have rich lifestyle, while for most of us, we are forced to sell our labor force for them. No, we want a clean planet, but also without human exploitation. In other words, we want human beings, all of them, to enjoy having an agency. Capitalism doesn't allow that. You'll still have a capitalist ruling class monopolizing the means of production, calling the shots on the labor process and reducing everyone else into workers, obeying their commands, and consumers passively consuming. So there is no agency in this, and so this isn't a desirable option. Plus, since capitalism is still alive and kicking, you still have scarcity. So there will always be a class of people excluded from not just production but also consumption. And so this is without mentioning all the criticism we've already explored against this view. For example, neoliberalism isn't a mistake or an accident in capitalism, but its natural continuation. So all of this to say that capitalism has to go away full stop. Restore the commons, re-establish radical abundance, and there won't be scarcity anymore. Being anti-austerity, to make sense, has to be anti-capitalism and anti-growth. In short, you have to be a degrowth communist. So among the necessary things to revise, or to epistemologically break from, is the notion of freedom. Like abundance, this notion got a distorted meaning in capitalism. We already hinted at it many times when we pointed to Marx's irony whenever he used the term free worker or free labor in a capitalist bourgeois setting. Freedom in capitalism is illusory, and we've already stressed, since it is predicated on how much money you have, it is freedom in scarcity. You can hardly conceive how how someone is, free with the kind of work we are forced into by capitalism. Instead, we have to conceive of freedom as restoration of the commons as well, and as radical abundance. This will also challenge the common misconception about communism, that it sacrifices freedom for equality. I mean, it does if you follow the illusory kind of freedom. What's the definition of this illusory freedom? Well, in the context of Saito, Illusory freedom is this. It is the American-style capitalist value system by which liberty is measured by the realization of a lifestyle that places the largest possible burden on the environment. So that's the first thing that you need in order to know if your freedom is real or illusory. The place it gives to the environment, to ecology. If your freedom is predicated on environmental destruction, if in order to be free, you have to destroy the earth, that's not a very good way to define freedom, is it? Freedom doesn't exist in a vacuum, but exists within material, physical conditions. Nature, then, is the precondition for your freedom. Capitalist freedom destroys nature in order to become a reality, meaning that this is a type of freedom that destroys its own conditions. It's a freedom that destroys what makes it possible in the first place. Sure, we can say that freedom is like an essential feature of being human, and as such, being free is also having the freedom to extinction by destroying the very foundations of our lives. So yeah, destroying willingly ourselves is also an expression of freedom. But is it really the kind of freedom that we want? And is this really what makes us a human being? Doesn't our essence include more than having, the freedom to extinction and drag in every life form along with it? So that doesn't seem like a good way to define freedom. So a better way to approach freedom is by distinguishing between bad freedom, the kind of freedom predicated on our extinction, and good freedom, the one predicated on abundance, equality, and sustainability. Once those features are secured, humanity flourishes because we have transcended the realm of necessity. We already explained what is real, what's the realm, of necessity, and the realm of freedom in the previous chapter on accelerationism, when we talked about gores and technology. So the realm of necessity, for a reminder, for Marx, is the realm in which humans must engage in necessary labor. Work required to produce and sustain physical or biological life, like growing food, making clothes, maintaining shelter, etc. In short, it refers to the range of acts of productions and consumption necessary to life. Bad freedom is one that doesn't transcend this realm, but wants us to live as if we did. It's a freedom that keeps reminding us that we are never safe from falling short of necessities, no matter how much we produce. And as such, it makes the unsustainable system on which it is predicated a necessity as well, as if without the very system that traps us even more in the realm of necessity, we'd always be more worse off. And as such, no one has really escaped this unavoidable sphere of labor in the realm of necessity. Activities determined by material survival and biological reproduction. Those who did only did so by subjugating others, by stealing the wealth produced by the labor of the many. So that's why it is illusory freedom, because, well, it's not freedom since it is not in its realm, but it is in the realm of necessity. Freedom only starts when that realm of necessity has been transcended, and it is in that realm of freedom that the essence of man can truly flourish. Humans aren't, confined to just necessity in the strict biological sense, like animals. All animal needs and activities, even emotional ones, are inherently instinctual. However, human beings are more than this. What is necessary for humans is to be what is necessary for them to be humans is beyond what is strictly necessary for survival. Necessity for a human being goes beyond, mere necessity. It is therefore in this realm of necessity beyond the realm of necessity, which is the realm of freedom. Now, the realm of freedom is a necessity for human beings, but it is a necessity different from the strict necessities of life. It is here that we find the range of activities that affirm our human nature. These include the arts, culture, friendship, romance, and even things like sports. You can argue that animals have many of these too, and I can agree with that. The distinction between the human and the animal isn't a distinction relevant anymore today, but we can take the word animal here to not to refer to actual animals, but let's say that the idea of an animal, the idea of a being that is strictly confined to the minimalist meaning of survival. But anyways, Here's Saito quoting from Marx's famous passage in Volume 3, Chapter 48, The Trinity Formula, comparing the two realms. The realm of freedom really begins only where labor, determined by necessity and external expediency, ends. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production proper. The freedom in this sphere can consist only in this: that socialized men, the associated producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. But this always remains a realm of necessity. The true realm of freedom, the development of human powers as an end in itself, begins beyond it, though it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. The reduction of the working day is the basic prerequisite. All right, so this is important to stress. When we say the realm of freedom is beyond the realm of necessity, we don't mean that human beings no longer need to eat or sleep or take shelter. The basis for the realm of freedom is the realm of necessity. But what Marx means here is that labor must, before jumping into the realm of freedom, secure the necessities of life. Labor exists in both realms, by the way. That would be another notion that we need to rethink as well. Now, work isn't just confined to what is painful to the body or must only be confined to what is necessary. Work can be enjoyable and an expression of our freedom, and it must be. The realm of freedom is also a realm of labor, but it's a labor of another range of activities than the activities in the realm of necessities. In the labor, the labor in the realm of freedom is the purpose of necessary labor. So we do necessary labor to be able to do free labor. And as such, the two types of labor must not be confused like capitalism does. So the point of necessary work is to provide the necessary stuff to be able to pass to free labor. Once the realm of necessity has been filled, now that we have enough food, shelter, clothing, etc., we can engage in all sorts of flourishing activities as well. This doesn't mean that necessary labor is coerced labor. It is also free labor in the sense that free workers come together to fulfill their mutual needs. It's just labor that most of us would find tiring, or we just find it necessary whether we enjoy it or not, in order to do what we consider more important for human beings or what we enjoy. It's just that it is free labor too, in the sense that no one can make us work more than we have to, because we are working to satisfy needs and just needs. So we'd have less labor in the realm of necessity, since we only aim at sufficiency, at what's enough, while the labor in the realm of freedom expands. We can do away with the forms of production necessary to we cannot do away with the forms of production necessary to provide food, clothing, shelter, or energy. I mean, that's a given, but we'll need less time to produce those and more time to work out, read, socialize, volunteer, make art, spend more time with friends, family, with lovers, etc. And so this is good freedom. It is both the expansion of the realm of freedom while also having a free control and agency in the realm of necessity. So we need cooperative works. We need a free association of workers. We need a communal management of the commons. We need a free management of the realm of necessity in order to enjoy the realm of freedom. So freedom in capitalism is, like we said, a freedom that extends the realm of necessity, stretching it to infinity if it could, and as such it traps us in an endless pursuit to satisfy animalistic desires and forces us to call that a freedom and existence suited for human beings. Saito says it best. He says, what we need to remember here is that the good freedom Marx wants to see flourish is not the material individualistic consumerism of capitalism. Thanks to the workings of capital, our lifestyles may look rich at first glance, but driving this apparent prosperity is the endless need to satisfy material desires. The satisfaction of these desires, the all-you-can-eat buffets, Fast fashions discarded and brought anew every season. The meaningless branding is all tied to the animalistic wants associated with the realm of necessity. The realm of freedom, on the other hand, begins once we are freed from the clutches of such base desires. According to Marx, the true essence of human freedom lies in collective cultural activities. So a system based on limitless growth traps us in necessity, since the purpose of work is no longer to satisfy needs, but to increase commodity value or exchange value as such. All of these are synonymous, by the way. It compels us to work long hours and drives to ceaseless consumerism. In the end, we feed and work for an economy rather than, having an economy that feeds and works for us. We're like, in Fritz Lang's 1927 movie, Metropolis, in that scene where you have industrial machines depicted as a monstrous entity that consumes the workers who operate them, like, workers being fed into the machinery. This is what we have to break from. Extending, the realm of necessity leads to those horrifying scenes from apocalyptic movies. So break capitalism, restrict the realm of necessity to what is necessary, and extend the realm of freedom, managing, a good balance between the two. Now, yes, this will mean that the levels of overall production will be lower than what they are today. But again, we are producing way more than what we need, and not only in scarcity, but also in an extremely unsustainable way. Lowering the levels of overall production is necessary because a huge part of that production is made of useless commodities. So lowering the levels of production actually means increasing the percentage of necessary production. So yes, there has to be voluntary self-limitation, but this is like, restraining to eat sugar and red meat every day while you have full access to vegetables. It's feasible and it doesn't threaten your quality of life. On the contrary, it enhances it. Like we said last time, abundance isn't a question of quantity, but of quality. Quantity will always be available in degrowth communism, even enough quantity for everyone to flourish, that is, while taking into account the differences between people, the varieties, and all of that. So we are talking about realizing happiness in a just and sustainable way. Yes, that requires self-limitation, but it actually leaves open a wide range of actions for all of us than we'd ever dreamed in capitalism. So it says the expansion of realm of freedom will come not from the reckless pursuit of higher productivity, but with the diminishing of the realm of necessity through restraint. In note 140, Saito mentions the Greek-French eco-socialist philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, who advocates for the kind of self-limitation that Saito is promoting. So Castoriadis is another one of those anti-capitalist thinkers who started as a Marxist and then, distanced himself from Marxism because he didn't know what Marx's late ecological thought was. And so in the book referenced by Saito, or a dialogue with the French politician Daniel Cohn-Bendit, it's called De l'écologie à l'autonomie, from ecology to autonomy. He says that both capitalism and Marxism are founded on the same Cartesian principle. We are to attain knowledge and truth in order to make ourselves masters and possessors of nature. But like Gors and other eco-socialists who are critical of Marx, they still provide significant insight. And in our context, that insight is Castoriadis' definition of autonomy. By self-limitation, what is meant is precisely that autonomy. So let's talk about Castoriadis' philosophy on autonomy for a minute. So Castoriadis starts by distinguishing between heteronomy and autonomy. Human beings have to live within limits. Okay, that's a given. The crucial thing is about how or who gets to decide on those limits. In heteronomy, the limits come from the outside. There are limits we attribute to God or nature and restrict our freedom, for example. But in autonomy, limits, they come from within. We consciously set them for ourselves. In Greek, the term nomos, in heteronomy and autonomy, means law or rule, custom, norms, etc. It's a limit. right? These rules define the limits necessary for a society to function. They're always made by people, of course, but most societies attribute them to a source that is outside society, some sort of imaginary, sacred source that that makes them, unquestionable. For example, the Ten Commandments is an example. These are rules that set limits to what people can do for society to function, but their origin is attributed to something that is outside that society. Okay, and so that's why it is heteronomy. Hetero in Greek means different or other. So here the rules come from something other or different from the society in which those rules are enforced, rather than from within the society itself. By contrast, autonomy is the opposite. These are rules that are decided by those upon whom they are to be enforced. Castoriadis traces the idea of autonomy to classical Athenian democracy. It's an idea he sees as revived by the Enlightenment, but according to him, it was left incomplete because of capitalism. You see, for autonomy to make sense, it has to be a posture that rejects dogmatism, otherwise it regresses to heteronomy. Autonomy and thus democracy, since in democracy it is argued that societies decide on their rules, if autonomy regresses to dogmatism, then it regresses to heteronomy. It will look for sources of truth that cannot be questioned, and thereby becoming dogma and become rules enforced from an outside source. Capitalism does precisely that through its hegemony and its market fundamentalism. But this can be also, science or technology. So capitalism for Castoriadis has a mission, which is the unlimited expansion of rational mastery over the world and nature. And this manifests itself in unlimited and incontestable economic growth that we are criticizing here. This is obviously at odds with democracy, and therefore it is preventing it to be complete. Democracy requires that we, just like, as a social group, we decide on the rules to follow, and this also applies to individuals as well. Individuals must be left to be able to choose their own limits. Not only capitalism dismantles all kinds of limits, and thereby putting all individuals in a state of war, of all against all. It's also, paradoxically enforces its rules, its own limits, meaning scarcity. Like capitalism forces us into behaviors that we've internalized rather than chosen through market pressure, the blackmail of ending up, poor and starved. It also forces us into lives that we don't want, that we didn't choose, so it imposes limits, while at the same time dismantles all real limits. So capitalism's imperative to expand cannot be questioned, hence becoming, a dogma, because there's this threat of not having enough, of never having enough, the threat of the same, scarcity that it generates. So we no longer ask, like Castoriadis says, whether there are needs requiring satisfaction, but whether some scientific or technical exploit or other is feasible. Like for capitalism, if it is feasible for the purpose of growth, it has to become a need. Therefore, we move from need satisfaction to need fabrication. Therefore, capitalism's pseudo mastery of nature becomes because a genuine mastery would be a life that respects nature's limits normally, and we are arguing that to respect nature's limits, genuinely limiting our behavior or desires must become from within. That's Castoriadis' point. So. So as I was saying, because capitalism is about need fabrication rather than satisfaction, the pseudo-mastery can never be fulfilled. Not only that, but we're now facing its consequences. We thought that we were mastering nature with fossil fuels, but now, we are faced with climate change. And therefore, ecology and autonomy go hand in hand. We have to be radically environmentalist to keep democratic spirit alive, since for Castoriadis, it is the only contemporary movement that questions, wants, and defends limits. Ecologists ask what a life worth living consists of, and for them, the idea that that the only goal in life is to produce and consume more is not only absurd, but also humiliating, since it deprives us of our autonomy. So, for Castoriadis, ecology isn't just love of nature, but the need for self-limitation, which is true freedom. Okay, need for self-limitation of human beings with respect to the planet on which they happen to exist by chance, and which, they are now destroying. So here again, he takes inspiration from the Greek notion of hubris. Now, in the context of autonomy, hubris takes a distinct meaning. Okay, for the Greeks, it did not just mean arrogance and overreach, but a transgression of previously undefined limits. Okay, so the limit doesn't come from an outside, but from within. Committing hubris wasn't about disobeying a limit already set by the gods, but about excess, taking too much of something, and therefore you remove it from its representative gods. If you, it's like you took what belonged to a deity and thereby you transgressed it. But autonomy means that it's not the god who will come to tell you this is the limit not to transgress. Hubris means that limits, boundaries cannot be set in advance. That's why, the Greeks call what they call, cautiousness, or phronesis, is required. That's why tragedy occurs, by the way. Tragic heroes don't commit hubris in a very explicit manner, but always discover after the act that they committed hubris. The heroes of ancient tragedies only learn that they are inhabited by hubris, by excess, once the catastrophe has taken place. So to avoid these excesses, individuals must be responsible and aware of their own limits, and hence Castoriadis argues we can have less suffering instead of destruction, to the extent that we can institute mechanisms that help us reflect on our wants and prudently manage those that are excessive. At the level of the individual, this is the mission of psychoanalysis, for example, for him, and at the level of the collective, this is the role of democracy. Psychoanalysis helps us come, to terms with desires and come to terms with death, and to overcome fear, to live rather than to be, paralyzed or turn violent, etc. And as for the Greeks, the point was to separate creative from destructive desires. So to release desire and to work to craft it. So this is the purpose of restraint. Self-limitation as autonomy means distinguishing creating desire from destructive desires, the kind of desires that is fabricated by capitalism, and the kind of desires that are good for societies and good for us, those creating desires. Okay, so destructive desires are fabricated by capitalism. Creating desires are those that are useful for society and even for the individual. Now, it's kind of difficult today to try to justify a lifestyle without restrictions. The entire climate change thingy, undeniably requires self-limitation. And it is, imperative that we understand self-limitation as good freedom. To limit yourself doesn't mean that you are less free. It just depends on the reason and purposes of that limitation, what we are, limiting exactly and in what way. When you look at the natural world, as temperatures, keep rising, you cannot deny that measures of limitation must be implemented. We've seen through this book that the current economic systems, capitalism, and the lifestyle that it promotes is making us closer to the great divergence. For a reminder, the great divergence is that point in which we'll be forced to choose what future we want, either barbarism, climate fascism, climate Maoism, or degrowth communism. Clearly, if we let things continue the way that they do, if we don't, put some restraints on ourselves, capitalism will either end up in fascism or barbarism, or those restraints will be imposed by an iron fist government suppressing all kinds of freedom, way more than necessary, as authoritarian regimes always do. Indeed, the climate crisis is at its heart a crisis from a lack of restraints. The capitalist system fosters an ethos of limitless consumption and unrestricted desires, and these eventually end up consuming resources beyond necessity and dominating other human beings as well. So the price is too heavy for both humans and the planets to let our desires, especially the artificial ones created by the market, to stimulate further production and consumption. It is too costly to let them run wild without restraints. Hence, if we refuse to think seriously about the kind of world we want to live in and what sorts of choices we must make to bring that future world about, it's either the war of all against all, or someone has to force restraints on us. But if we accept to think about what world to bring about, Saito says that we cannot solely rely on the natural sciences to find an answer. The natural sciences cannot teach us what a society founded on fostering the realm of freedom will actually look like. So the natural sciences just tell us facts about the natural world. It just tells you that if the atmospheric density of carbon dioxide exceeds 450 ppm, global temperatures will exceed the fixed limit of 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the tipping point, the point of no return. We've already seen why that's a point of no return, and all the solutions to what to do if that point is breached, the solutions of dream technologies like geoengineering, the NETs, the technologies that remove carbon from the atmosphere, and all of that, sci-fi shit. None of them will make a difference and are more likely to accelerate the process. That's all, what science can tell you. Temperatures must not rise beyond 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but it cannot tell you why they mustn't, as science doesn't really give a shit about human life or the quality of human life, and it cannot tell you the best way to keep those temperatures below 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That would require admitting that human flourishing is valuable, so you need science to also make the fact that human life is valuable and must be preserved, and that's why temperatures must remain under 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And then maybe it can even tell you why degrowth communism is better at maintaining those levels, because it will take into consideration the value of agency and autonomy for human beings, as these values are necessary for fulfilling life. But the propositions agency is valuable or human life has to be fulfilling, these are unscientific propositions. They are not facts in the scientific sense. So science cannot tell you why 35.6 degree Fahrenheit is more desirable than one with global temperatures that have risen by 37.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It can tell you beyond that, this and that phenomena will happen, this and that species will go extinct, and this and that area will become underwater, for example. But it cannot tell you that's bad. You shouldn't do that because your existence is valuable. Science doesn't really care. Of course, scientists do care when they conduct studies, and that's the point. What future, do we want? What is, the value of human existence and flourishing? We decide on those parameters of science. We decide what we want to know and for what purpose. Someone like Nordhaus, for example, who is satisfied with a 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit, we've seen is someone who doesn't think very highly of people working in agriculture and is willing to sacrifice them for the sake of the economy. So what counts as the right temperature will depend on our standards of satisfaction, which are very flexible and can be adjusted to given conditions. The conditions of a privileged white capitalist man in the north are very different from those of a poor Mexican farmer. Nordhaus has the means to adjust to 37.4 degree Fahrenheit temperature, so he can afford his biases towards promoting economic growth over stopping climate change and lobbying to integrate this bias into the value of the Paris Agreement. But for the farmer, that's a catastrophe for both his means of subsistence and his means of production. It's a tragedy for him, one from which he cannot recover. He'll be forced to move to another place where he and his family won't be welcomed and be confined to a life of poverty and lose all sense of self-sufficiency, etc. Like Nordhaus, future generations who won't experience life when temperatures were at their current levels may consider the levels at which they live as normal and natural, and even may be happy enough with those temperatures, while in the global south, more lives are being sacrificed. So that's what science cannot teach us. It's not from science that Nordhaus decides that it is okay to rise temperatures to 37.4 degrees, but out of his class interests. And these biases prevail everywhere, no matter what's your job or expertise. And as such, the solution to climate change cannot be the domain of scientists alone. That's why deciding what temperatures we accept to live in and what form of government suits our needs is a matter that has to be settled democratically. That's why it is up to us to take the utmost care in deciding at what temperature we wish to live and what sacrifices we are willing to make to achieve this. It's a question to be addressed democratically, not to be left up to scientists, economists, or artificial intelligence. Put another way, we must realize that there is no naturally existing limit out there for us to surpass. Any such limit is determined by what sort of society we decide we want to live in, a question of social custom and habit. The setting of limits can only be done through political processes that follow from economic, social, and ethical determinations. So, in other words, there is no scientific fact of it's bad to raise temperatures beyond 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That limit is not a natural limit, it's a social construct. We decided, giving our interest as a species and as human beings, that it is the right temperature for us, so that we can live in that safe and just space for human flourishing. But different groups of people, because of their class interest, can disagree on that limit, preferring to set it higher, thus advancing their interest while sacrificing not just the interest of other classes, of course lower classes, but also their lives in the process. In other words, it's absolutely unacceptable that Nordhaus gets to have a say in this matter, but not the Mexican farmer. This is, again, a rejection of politicalism. We also mentioned what that means in the episode of on accelerationism. So just to remind you, politicalism is the belief that the questions that concern us all should be left to politicians and experts. Again, in climate change, everything that is said or implemented comes from human perspectives and standpoints. It comes from class interests, from racial bias, from social backgrounds, etc. When politicians say that according to scientists and experts we can rise temperatures to 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit, there's nothing scientific about that. This is just a ruling class trying to find the best parameters to further advance its interests. Democratic processes, however, should include the interests of all. It is we, as a species, that need to decide on this, not the politicians, not the capitalists. The scientists must be included, of course, because their expertise is needed, but it's not up to them alone. So if we let them, then to quote Saito, the shape of the world to come will be determined solely by their interests and worldviews, dressed up as scientific objectivity. Alright, so we cannot just leave those matters to politicians and experts alone, because this is an issue that affects all of us directly. So it has to be debated passionately and democratically so that every voice is heard. This is not, something we can afford to fuck up, because it's also the voices of future generations as well that we must include. So the stakes are too high to just rely on the usual protocol. Questions about what sort of world we want to live in, that's a concern for everyone, including even non-human beings, as well as those who aren't born yet. It's a huge responsibility because, well, this is irreversible. We're not debating what kind of world we want, as if it's not, related to an irreversible global crisis. This is not a trial and error thing like, oh, we opted for a bad political organization, all right, let's just try another one then. No, this is a one and only shot. We cannot afford to try something else if our first attempt to combat it fails, like Saito says. Saito compares climate change to cloning and genetic editing. It's not really something in which you can say, it's okay if I fail, I'll try something else. When you tamper with genes, there has to be a limit, right? Cloning and eugenics are always very sensitive because of their ethical implications, which aren't theoretical but practical. They have concrete impact on politics and how we treat one another, and even to our understanding of what makes us human. If we cause irreversible changes in the human genome, that can change the very meaning of being human. This doesn't mean that we cannot, study or even, test things on the genome or edit it to change it, but it's about, highlighting that such decisions that will affect us and are irreversible should always be democratically debated. When it comes to the meaning of being human, I think, that concerns us all, it concerns all humans, and therefore there must be an inclusive and big enough reasonable medium to deliberate and take decisions democratically about this. Climate change is no different from this. It is by itself already changing the meaning of nature and the planet in ways that cannot be undone. Climate change is change in the fundamental functioning of the planet, and likewise trying to solve it with technologies like geoengineering that do not, that do to the planet what cloning and gene editing to do to the human genome, without consulting and without the approval of, well, humanity, that should be a direct and straight nope. So that would constitute a violation of one of the most fundamental human rights, perhaps the right that makes us human, the right of self-determination. Like we said, human beings don't express their human nature, their essence like animals do. They express it through, labor, meaning that they express it while consciously doing so. So this means that humans act upon their own nature. They shape it, and as such as it shapes them, they also shape it. Hence, from the start, what makes us humans, the nature of a human being is that capacity to shape his own nature. This is self-determination. Human beings are the only creatures who can determine themselves. Capitalism not only makes us reliant on it by taking away the means to self-determination, the means of production, but it also destroys and wants to claim to itself the right to even solve the problems that it caused, thereby reinforcing even more our powerlessness and inability to self-determine. It does it to the living, but also to the future generations. Geoengineering as a solution to climate change wants again to deprive the next generation of self-determination, making them reliant on such technologies to survive while temperatures keep rising. Thus, the only way out of climate change is, first, recognize and respect the right to self-determination, which relies on recognizing the importance of the natural world to support that right. That right is like freedom. We can only express it materially based on the natural world, our access to it, in short, the commons. So self-determination then starts by recognizing that there are limits that we cannot go beyond, because once we do, not only we take away other people's means to express that right, but we also jeopardize our own. Through this, we understand that nature needs to be free as well. It needs time to regenerate. It has cycles, metabolic interactions, and without those, nature dies, and with her, our chances at a free and fulfilling existence also dies. So, what is it that that's killing it and thus obstructing our right and freedom? Well, the Anthropocene, the widespread of human activity covering the entire globe for the sake of value, for economic growth. In short, we must retreat, we must slow down and stop, intervening this much. We need to stop tampering this carelessly with the natural world. So refraining from intervening, this is what Saito means by self-limitation, in the same line as, Castoriadis. This is where we come to note 141, where Saito refers to the book based on Castoriadis' notion of self-limitation. It is Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care, by Greek philosopher Gorgios Kallis. Not sure of the pronunciation, but I hope that I got it right. So according to Kallis, we shouldn't confuse self-limitation with limiting yourself by setting your own limits. We don't limit ourselves as in we sacrifice the things that make our lives meaningful for the sake of the planet, but rather becoming our own masters precisely so that we can lead meaningful lives. He used the Greek word in a footnote, oriothetici, where oreo means limit. Self-limitation is auto-oriothetici, meaning, the act of setting your own limits as opposed to just, limiting yourself. For example, the point of self-limitation is not to eat less, but to decide how much you want to eat and not eat more. This is, of course, has to be, a rational way of setting your limits. When you decide how much you want to eat, you need to set a rational reason for it, considering the impact on the planet, the impact on others, humans and non-human animals, is what, auto-oriothetici is about, giving humans back their responsibility. In the epilogue of the book, Kallis uses the metaphor of the piano, drawing both from his own childhood experience and from the film The Legend of 1900. He uses this metaphor of the piano to illustrate how limits enable creativity and freedom and why this matters for facing climate change. So he recalls that as a child, piano lessons felt like an imposed limit, like hours of practice that prevented him from playing with his friends, for example. And so he abandoned the piano when he could, thinking that, that he was freeing himself. Yet decades later, when he sat at the piano again without obligation, he discovered a new joy and was like, okay, these are my limits, the limits of my own making, within which, I can express my creativity. So setting limits is like that, when you choose the things you have to sacrifice other things for. Kallis, when young, he wanted to play with his friends instead of playing the piano, but his parents forced him to play the piano. So this makes the limit coming from outside. It was a heteronomy. And so this prevented him from developing, his creativity while playing the piano. But when he sat down later and started playing without, coercion, he found meaning in it. Now he wants to play the piano, and as such, whenever he has to choose between the piano and, playing with his friends, knowing that he cannot do both simultaneously, he freely chooses the piano. So the same situation, which at time one was a hindrance for his creativity, now becomes its conditions. It is the same limit, but because this time he chooses that limit, then he unleashes his creativity. So the piano here symbolizes the paradox of limit. They can feel like constraints, but when consciously embraced, they open the space for expression, depth, meaning, creativity, etc. So limits are necessary to have a meaningful life. Just as music requires the finite 88 keys to exist, if the keyboard is infinite, there's no music you can play, actually. So human life and society also need boundaries to flourish. Likewise, society needs to impose limits on itself if it hopes to achieve fulfillment for first, but also to survive climate change. So the key is precisely in that choice rather than having it imposed on us. So having a government like in climate Maoism imposing on us limits, sure, that can prevent the planet from dying from climate change, but as we stressed, the reason why we want the planet to survive is, and to live in a sustainable way is that we can enjoy meaningful lives. So the only way for that is if we choose our own limits, if we are auto-oriotheticist, if we don't embrace self-limitation by ourselves, if it is imposed on us, then it wouldn't be different from living while chasing limitless growth and ignoring planetary thresholds. So the ecological challenge is not about, being forced into limits by government or even by nature itself. Again, if those limits, are imposed by nature, it means that we are like Callus when he's young. He prefers playing with his friends, and so he's not convinced of the necessity of playing the piano. And therefore, he doesn't see its creative and meaningful potential. Thus, the ecological challenge is about learning to embrace self-limitation as a form of collective creativity and survival. Just as, music emerges from the discipline of finite notes, a just and livable future depends on choosing boundaries like, carbon budgets, consumption ceilings, limits to growth, etc. Not as punishment, but as the conditions for, freedom and meaningful life. Now, a key feature of the book is its reevaluation of Malthusianism. He argues that Malthus did not fundamentally argue for natural limits as he's often interpreted. Now, if you remember, Malthus is the guy who said that population growth itself leads to scarcity of resources. So at first glance, he looks like, he's arguing that we have to limit ourselves in order to survive. But in reality, the context in which he invoked scarcity is to legitimize inequality and justify growth. For Malthus, the poor were by definition those who are in excess and cannot be fed. And their suffering was necessary because this is how God makes us industrious. If we didn't suffer, we wouldn't work, right? And as such, he's not cautioning the poor to do less, but to encourage them to do more while remaining in poverty because that's the natural course of events. Malthus argues indeed that there is scarcity, but it's a scarcity that can never be avoided because human beings have inherent unlimited wants. But since unlimited wants cannot be satisfied, since they are unlimited while the resources are limited, the only way to survive is by having a hierarchy in which those at the top live in opulence while those at the bottom live in poverty, never able to satisfy their needs. So, but, this is good for him because, God created us to work, like that's our purpose, it's to be industrious, but we cannot be industrious if we don't suffer, otherwise why would we work? So we must constantly suffer in order to be industrious. But suffering comes from not satisfying your needs. If you had finite needs and finite resources, they both would match. Your needs are satisfied, and therefore you won't suffer. Thus, you don't need to be industrious. Thus, you won't be doing what God intended you to do, and that's bad, right? So, how can God make you work all the time? He obviously cannot make resources infinite, because if you have finite desires and finite needs, while resources are infinite, then there is no suffering. If you have infinite needs and infinite resources, both would match, and so no suffering. If both are finite, we said that matches too. So the only solution is if your needs are infinite, but the resources are finite. But then that's the tragedy of the commons. People would consume all the resources and die. And this is not what God wants, right? Therefore, God must add the hierarchy to maintain balance. The rich can indulge in their luxurious lifestyle, satisfying all of their desires, while the poor are constantly denied access to those resources. And so the shift codified scarcity as the essence of economic life. Callis emphasized that economics retained Malthus's premise of unlimited human wants and transformed it into the assumption that Homo economicus can never have enough. Thus, it is a rejection of limits. And so this narrative was instrumental in defending the emerging capitalist order, where poverty was reframed as inevitable rather than the outcome of enclosure, dispossession, and power. But Callis argues that this narrative was also taken by environmentalists as well. Ironically, when environmentalists stress the need for limits, they do so on a Malthusian basis. They say that we must have limits because the world has limits, but they also put at the basis of their analysis this idea that a human being has unlimited needs. And this is exactly the same false premise underlying the tragedy of the commons. There are scarce resources, but human beings have unlimited wants and desires and needs. If you start with this first Malthusian premise, whether you are an environmentalist or a capitalist, you will end up arguing in favor of growth. If the problem is that resources will run out, then the solution is to produce more efficiently or to expand technological capacities, thus reproducing the cycle of growth. And against this trap, Kōhei calls for a reorientation towards self-limitation. Rather than treating limits as external constraints imposed by nature, he proposed that society should consciously choose their own boundaries. And this is where he draws inspiration from Castoriadis' self-limitation as autonomy. But he goes a bit further than him. Castoriadis promotes self-limitation because it would, guarantee us freedom and spare us the consequence of hubris. But there's also a third reason, and this is justice, or as Kōhei calls it, care for the other. Since limitless expansion inevitably colonizes and assimilates the life world of others, humans and non-humans alike, confining self-limitation to just freedom and the bad consequences of hubris without its ethical dimension is not sufficient. Kōhei mentions another philosopher, who I'm going to butcher the name, but it's Jörg Reichmann or Reichmann. So it is spelled Jorge. So that's Jörg, and Reichmann or Reichmann, Reichmann. So this guy, he said, only self-limitation makes possible alterity, leaves space for the other. So this means that our way of life must be ethical in that it considers the other's space. If self-limitation doesn't include the space of the other, then it wouldn't be a great motivation to abandon the imperial mode of living, but will make concessions to it. In other words, we should live simply so that others can simply live. This starts with recognizing that our current lifestyle cannot keep going, the very mode of production by which we live and supply our necessities and organize our life around, that has, to be seriously rethought, but by which we mean overthrown when we say rethought. So this first targets the global north and their hubris, like Saito says. Those of us living in the developed world must actively examine the things we produce, determining which ones are unnecessary and doing away with them, then looking at the things we do need and deciding how much of them it's really necessary to produce. Under the hegemony of capital, which drives us towards unceasing, unrestrained consumption, it's nearly impossible to attain the freedom necessary to choose such self-limitation. After all, it's a condition of capital accumulation economic growth that no one restrain themselves at all. So self-limitation, it is, breaking from the hegemony of capital. It is capital that keeps, expanding, plundering all resources in its process of self-valorization. Capital keeps intervening where it shouldn't, disrupting all kinds of natural and social metabolisms. It feeds, it is constantly hungry, and it makes us, hungry as much as it is too, So capital only grows through our unrestrained consumption. The more commodities we want, the greater its intervention in the natural world. So limiting the spread of capital starts also with limiting our consumption. This isn't the same old song of, putting the blame on the consumer. That would amount to nothing more than the kind of solutions we already ruled out from the very first episode, the eco gestures, the individual solutions, while, forgetting about collective solutions. So this would mean choosing the naive pacifist standpoint and forget that this requires a revolution. In other words, we cannot just stop at consumption. The revolution must also take place in the process of production itself by reclaiming the commons. And so that's a revolution. But such a revolution will need people who are willing to embrace self-limitation, who are willing to prioritize needs over desires. I mean artificial desires, the kind of desires that obey capitalist logics. So this is not to say that there cannot be gluttons or that people, must live in strict moderation. People can still, let themselves go if they wish. They can, follow without restraint their most passionate and irrational desires. It's just that they need to have a political consciousness, meaning an awareness that there has to be a limit, otherwise those desires can serve as justification for suppressing other people's freedom. So going nuts needs to be within limits, as not to cause harm to others, not to deplete resources that others rely upon, and of course this is all about desires that require the consumption of a physical limited resource. We're not talking about sexual desires or partying for 3 nights straight or consuming drugs. It's just that production and consumption need to be collectively planned. That requires that people, be willing to give up on some desires, or more precisely, to just, limit them to what's physically available to satisfy them. And the reason why I say people have to be willing to is because if we don't want to limit our consumption and production, then someone else will have to do it for us, and thereby taking away our freedom. So the realm of freedom doesn't just rely on the right control over the realm of necessity, but that control, must come from within. It must not come from an outside agency forcing measures down on us, okay? That's, climate Maoism. It has to come from us. We must be willing to do so. And so we must voluntarily choose the path of self-limitation, otherwise it's not a revolution, and it won't be anti-capitalistic either, since top-down solutions to climate change will always use locking technologies, and at best it would be state capitalism. So, to conclude, the only possible reasonable path to avoid climate catastrophe is to choose willingly and voluntarily a version of self-limitation that will enable everyone to thrive in a sustainable way. So that means breaking completely from capitalism and its dreams of unlimited economic growth and realize a future of degrowth communism, and only then we will expand the realm of freedom like Marx hoped in volume 3. Next time, we will start reading the 7th chapter about the concrete steps that we can take to bring about such a future. That's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Like always, subscribe, like the video, share